All right, let's go ahead and kick off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We've got a good crew. I'm Tim Ballmer from the UC Berkeley Library's Scholarly Communication and Information Policy Office. So what do? We help students, faculty, and scholars understand publishing, copyright, and information policy issues that they may face in their research, teaching, and academic publishing. This is our final event of our Fall 2025 workshop series. In September, we talked to PhD students about how copyright intersects with creating and publishing their dissertation. Last month, we explored how graduate students and faculty can utilize metrics, scholarly profiles, and also smart practices to maximize the reach of their research and writing. And today, of course, we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of publishing an academic book. We're going to be returning in the spring semester with some more programming, including some sessions on publishing digital books with Pressbooks, and also exploring open access publishing support option for UC Berkeley faculty and students. So let us know if there's another topic you'd like information on. We're happy to do individual consultations on Zoom or at the library, or even develop another workshop if there's a topic of mutual interest to people. And I'm going to drop our office's email address in the chat right now. So we've got a great lineup of speakers who have generously agreed to share their expertise on the process of publishing a scholarly book. Perhaps some of you are working on your dissertations and are interested in taking that research into a book-length treatment. So our goal with the conversation today is to help demystify some of the academic book publishing process a bit, and to give you some practical advice on things like what it's going to take to revise your dissertation, how to develop a book proposal, tips for interacting with press editors, how to address some legal considerations, and much more. So I want to introduce our panelists for today. So Raina Polivka is Senior Editor in Film, Media, and Sound Studies at the University of California Press. She joined the UC Press in 2015. And Raina has been a lead coordinator from the press on the First Gen Scholars Program. This seeks to cultivate and support the work of students and scholars who are the first in their family to receive a college degree. Jacob Grumbach is an associate professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. And Jake studies the political economy of the United States with interests in democratic institutions, labor, federalism, racial and economic inequality, and statistical methods. And his book, Laboratories Against Democracy, How National Parties Transform State Politics, it was published by Princeton University Press in 2022. And finally, Dave Hansen is Executive Director of Authors Alliance, which is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization working to advance the interests of authors who want to serve the public good by sharing their creations broadly. Prior to joining the Authors Alliance, Dave was an associate university librarian and lead for copyright and information policy at Duke University Libraries, and he has extensive experience teaching and advising researchers, publishers, and librarians on copyright, fair use, and also author rights. So big shout out to our speakers today and welcome. So just a little bit about the structure of the discussion. We've prepared a short set of questions tailored to each individual panelist's role and experiences within the book publication process. So we'll use the first part of the session to talk with each of them separately. So we're going to start with Raina first, and then we'll go to Jake, and we'll end with Dave. Then we'll have some time for you to ask questions to the panelists as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen sharing right now, just so it's a bit easier to see our speakers as we begin the conversation. So great. Let's start with Raina. So to kick things off, can you give us an overview of the University of California Press? So what sorts of books does the UC Press publish? And can you talk a little bit about do different university presses specialize in particular subject areas?
Absolutely. All great questions, Tim. So, first of all, UC Press has been around for over 250 years. We are among the largest university presses in the university press kind of ecosystem. We're up there with presses like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Chicago, MIT. And importantly, we are the only press among that prestigious group that is associated with a public university. So we take that association very seriously. We are a very mission-driven publisher, which means that even though book sales mean a lot to us, because we don't receive a lot of endowments or support. We do need to be able to sell our books, but more importantly, we prioritize kind of elevating voices. We really seek out authors that are trying to contribute to new conversations and their disciplines or more for a wider audience, these kinds of things. So UC Press is also among the top publishers in both the humanities and social sciences. We have burgeoning lists as well in economics, technology studies, and the natural sciences. But we specialize in anything from film and media studies to music and sound studies, history, American, ethnic, race and gender studies, to the social sciences like anthropology, sociology, criminology. Um, we primarily, as many university presses, we were founded on the idea of publishing and disseminating quality peer-reviewed scholarship. So we primarily publish what's called the monograph, which is what many of you will be working on for your first book project or subsequent book projects. This, of course, is long-form scholarship. It's usually for a narrower audience, right? You're writing for a specific discipline. The monograph really serves a purpose in your own kind of career in terms of tenure and promotion. So because many of these books do have such narrow audiences, in order to kind of subsidize the monograph publishing that we do, you can imagine sales are not that robust. We also publish different kinds of books. So we do publish those scholarly monographs, but we also publish at UC Press what we call academic trade books, books that have that are part of a larger conversation that might be outside of the academy or written by authors who are not just scholars, but might have platforms in activist circles or have larger kind of public-facing platforms. We also publish trade books. These, of course, are for very widely public audiences. They're more synthetic, they're less argument forward. Um, we have a very robust open access publishing program as well. So these are books that are digital first and that are widely available to anyone in the entire world for free. So very exciting. We've been one of the leaders in that space. So that's an exciting thing to be a part of. So we publish in a multitude of disciplines. We publish a multitude of kinds of books, and that is really the case for all university presses. They all have their own specialties that they are strong in. And so part of the process of finding a good home for your work is really doing some of that boots on the ground kind of exploration. You can do this at conferences by walking down exhibit, in the exhibit hall. You can do this by visiting press websites and looking at their catalogs. What are they publishing in the last 3 years? That is really exciting. And I think what most people end up doing is kind of crowdsourcing. Who's publishing where? What was their experience like? What kinds of books were you citing in your own dissertation and research? This really informs the kind of press that you might seek out for your book.
Terrific. Let's move on to talking about some of the stages of the book publication process from the perspective of you at the press. So, say I'm a PhD student with a dissertation that I want to eventually revise into a book. Where do I start? What things should prospective book authors be thinking about or doing before they even try to contact a particular publisher about the possibility of writing a book?
Great. Thanks for asking that, Tim. So, first of all, it's really important for you to recognize that the dissertation, I'm sorry, that the book is going to look very different from the dissertation, right? So, the dissertation is written under a lot of pressure, sometimes duress. It's very much an exercise in demonstrating expertise. You have a lot of different pressures that you're navigating during that process. And you're writing for a specific audience, which is really quite narrow. It's usually your committee, right? So the dissertation is a very different kind of genre unto itself. Um, the thing to think about when you start thinking about the book project, is to really start thinking of yourself first and foremost as a writer. And it's important, and I often tell authors this, and especially first-time authors, take a break from the dissertation, tuck it away for a while, start reading widely, start reading like a writer. So picking up those books that you encountered during your research, picking up those a novel or even poetry can help you kind of reappreciate the power of the word and the craft of writing. So treating the book really as its own kind of writing exercise. Um, the other thing I often suggest, even before you start piecing together the proposal, and these kinds of things, is to start test driving some of your material in these more public facing places. So participating in conference talks, test driving some of your chapters or some of your material that you worked through in your dissertation, and hearing from your colleagues what's working, what's really exciting, what do people want to hear more about. So populating those spaces that you feel that you identify and as an intellectual and as a scholar is really important. That will help inform you, what direction to take for the book project. I think, the dissertation, you can get a lot of mileage out of a dissertation that doesn't necessarily need to be book focused. So some of your dissertation chapters could easily find their way perhaps into a journal article. Um, as a publisher, I often encourage, especially first-time authors, to get at least one or two journal articles published. This is a great entry point into academic publishing in general. You'll be familiar with kind of the peer review process, the revision process, all of that by way of journal publishing. But it also helps establish you as an expert in the field. So to have that publication or that pending publication underway really gets your name out there in a way that can only help the publication of your later long form research project. Now, importantly, that comes with a caveat. You don't want to give away like that nugget that you want to be the center of your book, right? You want to save the really good stuff for the book project. So the journal articles should really be a little bit like satellites that kind of circle around your larger research project. Um, and and importantly, most publishers, I believe it's this way across almost everyone I've talked with. They typically say, publishing, if you have two book chapters that were originally articles or were versions of them were articles, that's fine. But if you're publishing a lot of your book chapters first as journal articles, that can become problematic. Um, so just some advice there from that perspective.
That's great. So take some time away from your dissertation. Think about publishing some journal articles, but not too many. So say I've done some research and I think UC Press or another university press might be a good fit. How do I begin an interaction with a press in a productive and effective fashion?
Absolutely. You know, I think having I think at the end of the day, having the ability to talk with an editor can be really invaluable. So I encourage you to reach out to editors before you head off to a professional conference, for example. Um, I think there's like 2 points that we often say. You can think about it in two ways. One, is a more informal encounter. So just stopping by a press booth at an exhibit hall and striking up a conversation, just, meeting an editor saying this is what I'm working on, would this be of interest, can be a really great way to just sort of feel out where that publisher or that editor is kind of focusing some of their acquisitions. Um, when you have a proposal, like when you've really kind of established this is what the book will look like, um, setting up like a 30-minute meeting with an editor at a conference is a great idea. Reaching out maybe a month in advance as they're starting to put together their meeting schedule is a good time to do that. And the other thing I'll say too is since the pandemic, I mean, one of the great things that's come out of this is, of course, this Zoom space, this virtual space where we can meet kind of screen to screen and have a conversation. I find that having the ability to have these verbal conversations really is invaluable. You're always, of course, free to reach out to editors over email, and you can usually find their information on the press websites. There's some important things to know, though, about that initial contact. Number one, I think identifying, and I think this is one of the most important things you can do in that initial outreach email, is to identify why you think that press is the best press for your work. So, is that press publishing books that you think are in dialogue with your work? And if they are, definitely call that out in that initial email. Does that press publish a specific series that you think your work might be a candidate for? That's a great thing to call out there. Has that press published a mentor of yours or a colleague of yours? These are things that you can kind of call out in that initial email to get your form of communication to rise to the top of the pile, right? That'll be important. And then coming prepared with like, that elevator pitch, 3 sentences about what makes your topic exciting, what makes it unique, and why there needs to be a book about it. I think these are some things to really have prepared when you talk with an editor. One important though, is when you have that conversation with your editor or with a potential editor, don't feel like you need to prepare like a slideshow or have a formal presentation. These are really opportunities to kind of get to know one another. You have the power to pick out the editor as much as that editor has the ability to choose to work with you as well. So, kind of learning a little bit about that editor's style, about what's important to them, really trying to have that dialogue can be a great way to start a conversation.
Terrific. Let's pivot a bit to the book proposal. Could you
Sure.
talk about what information commonly goes into a proposal? How can a prospective author be successful in writing a solid proposal? And kind of what will catch your attention as an editor for like an interesting book project?
Great. Yeah. So these days, most presses have proposal guidelines on their website. So I encourage you all to seek those out for presses that you're interested in. But I like to say that a proposal is also a genre unto itself. And uh, there are, if we think of when we think about publishing, we're always talking about who is the audience for your book. Well, for the proposal too, there's a specific audience for your proposal. The first person, of course, is someone like me, an editor, who will be evaluating whether your work is a good fit for their list or for the press. Um, the other audience that you'll be writing for is a peer reviewer, so colleagues in your field who might be assessing the rigor and the quality of your work. And then at UC Press, the third audience for the proposal is our internal books team. So a proposal offers our internal staff, that is people in production and marketing, publicity and sales and design, an opportunity to understand your vision for your work, and to kind of get on board with the product and the thing that you want to emerge from this process. So, with that in mind, you're writing towards those three audiences, and so it needs to do the work of a scholarly project, right? It needs to have like that, it needs to refer to the conversations, to the other scholarship out there that you're in dialogue with. It needs to grab the attention of people who might not be familiar with your field. Um, you know, I am not an expert in, I'm not necessarily an expert in all of the books that I publish, but I am an expert reader. I know what readers need to be able to have a good reading experience. And as someone who might not be well versed in Middle Eastern rap and sound studies make me interested. How do you kind of make people interested in your work? So really positioning it along those what we call those marketing hooks. But a proposal has to lay out the topic of your work, your main argument. It also needs to, again, identify how you're positioning it in the field. We call this a market assessment. So, what are like the 3 to 5 other publications out there that that you see your work in dialogue with? It needs to provide a table of contents, which should be annotated. So each at the providing that kind of chapter summary that demonstrates how all of those chapters work together and how you're building your argument across those chapters. Those chapter summaries might also highlight different archives or methodologies that you're engaging with, different case studies that might help illuminate some of these concepts. Um, the proposal should also include what we call the nuts and bolts. So it should specify how long you think your book will be, how many illustrations or music examples or graphs or any sort of interior visual elements you think you will need for your argument to unfold, any sort of audio visual components as well. So these kinds of things. And then finally, we always ask our potential authors to list out peer reviewers' suggestions. So listing out, perhaps 5 people in your field, or importantly, if you're working interdisciplinarily across those different disciplines, who could provide really good feedback for your work. These people, of course, should not be on your committee. Ideally, the people that we send books out to for peer review will have published a book of their own, so they too will have gone through the process of peer review, um, and should be able to provide constructive feedback.
Great. Let's do one more question with you, Raina. So let's talk about the revision and publishing process, focusing on the relationship between the author and the publisher. So could you talk a little bit about what expectations you have for authors as they go through the revision and publishing process? And also, what does the time frame sort of look like from, say, a proposal accepted to a published book?
Great. I typically like to say, especially for these first book projects, kind of carve out about 2 years from acceptance of the proposal to the final book project, or I should say from delivery of the proposal to the final book project. At UC Press, and this is the case with many presses, if we are choosing to evaluate your work at an advanced stage, so based on a proposal and sample chapters, then that means that your work will have to go out to peer review twice. So it will go out for peer reviewers to get that contract. But then once the complete manuscript is finished, it will have to go back out to peer reviewers. Um, so, that process peer review can take up to 8 to 10 weeks, and people are really, as many scholars know, strapped for time, and have pretty challenged bandwidths. So you have to account for peer review and then also for the revision process. In addition to the completion of the thing itself. So 2 years is a good average from sending in the proposal to getting that bound book in your hand. Um, from my perspective, and this is again, and this is why I say have conversations with editors to really, and with your peers who have worked with editors to really understand how different editors work, because we all work differently. For me, I really like to take that opportunity at the early stage with the proposal and the sample chapters to do a deep dive and to really make sure that I understand what you wish to achieve with the project. What does success look like for you? Are the chapters fulfilling the promises made in the proposal? Are there specific, if your audience, let's say, is interdisciplinary, are there access and entry points for these multiple different kinds of scholars to kind of get into your work and understand it? These are the things that I really look for in those initial stages. I rely on the peer reviewers to do that really kind of that qualitative work, right? They're looking to make sure that your argument is solid, that you're citing people that should be cited and things of these sorts, or finding or flagging places that need a little bit more context, etc. I'm really focused on that reading experience. And so that's where I really do my deep dive to make sure we're on the same page. And then ideally, if we're moving forward at an earlier stage, we have the book contracted and it goes back out to peer reviewers. Ideally, we're getting those same peer reviewers on board that saw earlier materials so they can see how you've developed your ideas, how you've responded to those initial peer review reports, and can ideally turn things around a little bit faster because they're already familiar with your project. So that's kind of, there's more nuances there, certainly to talk about. I mean, peer review is also its own thing. So happy to talk about that further. But that's really the kind of development process I try to work towards with my authors. I do see it as very much a partnership. And by the time I send things out for peer review, um, I really am not looking for peer reviewers to go, yes, you should publish this, or no, you should not publish this. I'm really looking, by that time, I've invested time with the author and with the material. I really want peer reviewers to help make it better, to inform us how do we make this better, right? So that's kind of my, I guess, my philosophy on that process.
Great. Thank you so much for this insight into what's going on at the press.
Yeah.
And stick around. We'll come back at the end for people to ask more questions of you. Let's pivot over to Jake to talk with you for a bit from the author's perspective. So, you published your book, Laboratories Against Democracy, in 2022 with Princeton. So, let's explore some of the similar questions that I asked Raina about the process, but hearing from your perspective as the author. So, can you talk a bit about where did the idea for your book start? And how did you take some of your existing scholarship, either your dissertation or other articles, in preparing to start this book project? And then also, could you talk about who did you go to for advice and guidance in this process?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, great event. Thanks for running the show, and nice to see everybody in the room. My book was a pretty standard dissertation book, converted dissertation. I'm a quant, and that makes it a little, you know, similar overlapping paths in the humanities and in qualitative social science research and so forth. But I would say I did a dissertation that was in between the sort of three standalone paper style dissertations in the social sciences and the book style dissertation. It essentially was, some semi-related papers with not much connective tissue, but a little intro and a little conclusion. But it gave me enough scaffolding, and some of these chapters were published as academic journal articles. And it gave me enough scaffolding to pitch a book proposal. Um, and I was able to use most of the content from the dissertation pretty clearly, like the, empirical evidence and the arguments and things like that. And I luckily had a publisher that was very supportive of, just putting in the acknowledgments, like parts of this book were published in these various journal articles. That was incredibly liberating. But the big thing is that the books are entirely different, need entirely different front end and back end and connective tissue, and that's actually just more important than potentially than the underlying, data graphs from the quant side of things. And I'll just keep, telling the story until you stop me, Tim. But
Go
jump
for
in
it.
anytime. But I started my postdoc at Princeton, and I completed my dissertation and go to one of those, there's some free food at this lunch with the publisher from Princeton University Press, a sort of like meet and greet, Q&A session. I went and heard, talked about, the potential process. Then I sent the publisher, essentially, I had, as part of my dissertation, actually, um, So I had my dissertation. I sent in the full dissertation. I sent in a book proposal as well. And I sent in these related published journal articles. And I sent in a working paper that was essentially spin off of the dissertation on thinking about changes to democratic institutions at the state level. And that like last sort of substantive chapter ended up being sort of the frame of the whole book. And that was sort of like listening to the audience. Over time, I'm presenting these things in seminars, I'm trying to get things published. I'm noticing that the discipline is responding a bit more to that. So then the entire book frame, even though it contains essentially the dissertation material plus that additional like chapter and a half that I wrote as an additional paper during my during my postdoc, the frame of the book dramatically changed in that way. So and the most important parts of the book in working with the publisher, or first, I guess I should do the contract stuff. So I was very lucky. I pursued an advance contract with this material. It was, I'd say, a substantial amount of material plus a book proposal. Um, I lucked out in that, I think, the people who were the series editors, I got first that the publisher would even send the series editors this to first decide if they'd send this out for review. And I lucked out in that they generally liked my work, and I think I'd seen me present this work over the years and things like that. And the series editors okayed it. Um, and then I would say the big shock, I think, no matter what your field is that in writing a book, like there is a specific template to it. That was one thing I didn't quite understand is that academic books do have a structure. If you write academic journal articles like myself, you get the science of it eventually. Like, okay, this is how the intro is structured. This is how the abstract's structured. This is the next section. Like, you know, this is like empirical section one. Here's like 1B for like a spin-off part of it. You get the structure down to like it's now in my nature writing an intro of a journal article. It's like, hook, the research gap. Here's my paper, and here's the implications. Like it's just so ingrained in me. And the publisher, the editor at Princeton, who is relatively hands-on, and I like that, and I think there's publishers vary, she said, keep reading this book, Steadfast Democrats, which we just published. And this is a book, it's a Black politics book about political behavior and sort of survey experiments and political psychology. That is extremely not my area. Like, I'm a political economist, study public policy, observational data, inequality. I absolutely focus on racial inequality, but like political behavior and psychology, absolutely not. So I kept going, like, why does she keep saying this? I know this book, it's won a lot of awards. I know the authors, but like this just doesn't make any sense. And I was like that for months until I kept trying to write the most important chapter, the first chapter of the book, kept getting feedback like, you need to make this more accessible. You need to make this clearer, and better structured. And I kept going like, I don't know what you're asking me for here, and why are you sending me this book again? And then I started reading that book, and I noticed in just reading other books along the way, I noticed there's like a much more coherent standard structure to an intro chapter than I had realized, even across sort of areas. And when I adhered a bit more to the structure, suddenly everybody, the peer reviewers, the editor, everybody started going like, wow, what an improvement. And I was like, do they know I'm doing this? I'm like following this other book paragraph by paragraph, being like, what is this paragraph doing? And sort of crafting my paragraph similarly. And you can, of course, I customized things and had a different little subsection in there. Um, but
So
I was shocked at how straightforward and that was very like and that was the moment of enlightenment, I would say, in the book publishing
so
process for me.
so your editor really helped you understand the common structure that they sort of needed for the book to be what it is. Okay, great,
That's
great.
right. And I
Can,
would say like you don't realize like we get told this all the time that when you're in your field, you don't understand what others, you know, even within your field need in terms of bringing them through ideas, concepts, structure, and just however far you think you've moved in that direction, you have not moved far enough when you're writing your first book. That's a
so
dissertation book, especially.
Right. So you mentioned talking with the Princeton folks at a conference or an event, which sounds exactly aligned with what Raina was talking
It's
about.
very much so.
Um, how did you decide on to go after them, or is it are they publishing things that your colleagues are publishing, or is that a particular press that you were interested in, or can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was it was some, advisor advice and things like that. There's a kind of set of prominent poli-sci publishers and series, and a lot of the publishers may publish outside of these key series. So in political science, there's usually like a U.S. institution series, which I am in, a U.S. behavior series, like that Steadfast Democrats book on sort of political psychology, voter behavior, things like that. And then there's comparative politics institutions. There's sort of political economy ones, political philosophy and theory series, right? So those tend to signal some prestige. And then the other thing was Princeton was known for being like relatively small publisher and that they could focus on me. But it was also just like proximity. Like I went to that, had a good working relationship. And the series editors, it was Suzanne Mettler and Theda Scotchpole, very prominent scholars in my field who I really liked their work over the years and felt like they shaped a lot of my like intellectual path and things. So wanted to see if I could get in that series, and yeah, the rest was pretty laid out in that way. I would say
Great,
it's a
great.
slog too. Like there's all sorts of things I can say about the that process of having the material empirically and the arguments and things, but it's a real delicate art and some tedium to continue editing for accessibility and clarity. It's not the deepest intellectual exercise for academics who are interested in generating new knowledge rather than honing the conveyance of that knowledge.
Mhm.
So that was a long slog, but it worked out. And I think I was surprised that on the after the fact the book did better than I expected in part through really making an effort to be clear and hit the reader over the head with the arguments. Like, I love the metaphors I learned along the way and adages of like, you have one note in your song you can play. You better hit that note clearly, and repeat your argument and then repeat it, then make the argument and give some evidence and repeat it again. And those things really
Nice.
stuck with me and did become lessons.
Can you
Other
talk a
thing is
bit?
you can be bolder in a book. You can be a bit broader about the implications, and that clarity really gives a signal. And don't worry too much about the new, there's plenty of space in and notes and in chapters to bring on the nuance, but nuance is not a great look for the front end and back end.
Great. I want to talk a bit about your experience with the author contract, and you said you were provided an advance contract. Could you unpack that a little bit for for folks here, what that means?
Yeah.
And were there particular things in the contract that stood out to you, or things that were important to you as an author?
I would say thanks. No, my goal was to publish the book, on a reputable press, and I
Right.
knew really nothing. They told me, "Ooh, negotiate for some paperback thing or audiobook thing." I tried, and there's an audio version and a paperback now, and I appreciate that. I, you know, there were other things I understand people negotiated for, but for me, I'm not the best business person and wanted to just get the book out there. But the advance contract I liked for the security of it all. And that was essentially a contract contingent on getting through peer review, which you probably already understood from this panel. Peer review in the book process is much less antagonistic the editor wants your book, particularly if they give you a contract, they extremely want to get this over the finish line. It's
Yeah.
totally different than publishing in journals in that way. So you can work your way out of negative reviews if that does happen. And it's much more powerful editor model. And I like the idea that, okay, the series editors okayed this, so that's a signal. Then the peer reviewers with that content said, like, this is great. But then when I sent the full manuscript, book version, right, which had a lot of the same content, the peer review was more, I wouldn't say negative, but it was a lot of this, like, yeah, great graphs and, the papers are good, but it's like, it's not a good book yet, like.
It was more critical.
It was more critical, and it was especially critical on the structure, the
Mhm.
frame, the front end, connective tissue, transitions, and so forth.
Right.
Um, that, I already was trying to do that, but that kicked me further in gear. But the advanced contract point, I think I was pretty lucky for a first book contract to get that advanced contract.
Okay.
And it was the stars aligned a little bit. And my sense is most first book contracts, you have to really prepare the manuscript at least mostly fully, get not just a standard contract at that point.
Right.
And in that case, you can do the concurrent. With the advanced contract, I didn't pursue other publishers, with people send their full manuscript to multiple publishers to see if series editors will accept them, send to peer review and things like that.
So Raina mentioned, at least in her perspective, usually takes about 2 years proposal to publishing. What was your timeline for publishing with Princeton? And also, did you do any promotion for your book? Did you do a book tour or talks? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that's about right. Like I got the advanced contract. I started my assistant professor job in 2019 fall. Yeah, that sounds about right. Maybe a little longer
Okay.
to with the advanced contract. Um, but it comes out. One thing I do appreciate the publisher for is they got it out. Like other books were coming out with similar topics and things, and I kind of got ahead in award season, like the way academic year structures and conference awards and things happen. Like I kind of looked out that way too, where I was like the first. I think if the ordering of these other two books were different, like I would have been less lucky. Things like that happened. So I was very in one, I know these other, it's a small world, and like this set of co-authors, they were kind of like annoyed that their publisher took a little longer because we sent in our final copy edits, I think similar time, and theirs took like 2 extra months, and
Hmm.
that helped me. Then promotion, yeah. So I had a tough time getting my first assistant professor job. As many do, like that's, you know, often the hardest gate to open in the process, and getting tenure is ironically tends to be in most university contexts outside of like some top three universities, like considerably easier than getting the job in the first place. So I was struggling, and I said sort of like, I'll be more myself, and I got on social media more, and I, talked my own, political, you know, thoughts about things. That did end up being helpful, getting in the conversations. Um, And I also did the standard, it was COVID-ish, like, and the COVID, academic closures and things like that. So I would do Zoom library lectures and things at public
Hmm.
libraries that the publisher had arranged. Those were relatively small, but then I tried to, to the extent I could, I did some small time media and things, but it bubbled up a little bit where I don't exactly know how it happened, but there's some crossover academics like credit, like who are editors at like the American Prospect style places or the New Republic. That helped bubble up to the ultimately where some New Yorker writers like seemed to be cite the book a few times, and then it got on this New Yorker list of books of 2022. And that kind of was incredibly lucky. Again, I don't. this is the other thing. So I'm a quant and, do causal inference stuff. So I can say this survivor bias is crazy. Advice of highly, 10 habits of highly successful people is not like an actual you know, inference you can draw. Like, unfortunately, I just lucked out on so many of these stages. It's important that there's so much randomness in academia and these processes. It's just important to never get too high or too low in these processes. But there are some lessons I hope you can glean. But one is to just be clear with your argument, and say
Mm.
like there's a lot of uncertainty on a lot of these big questions of human civilization and being clear to the point where like another adage was, can the like just regular NPR, like a regular, person with a bachelor's degree, can they really get your argument in one sentence? If it's not like that, no matter your field, and like a regular NPR listener type can't get it in a sentence, like so you have to continue honing it.
Right. So thank you so much. These are great experiences to share with the people here. Um, Again, stick around. If anyone has questions, start thinking about them for Jake. And let's talk with Dave a little while. Dave, welcome.
Hi.
So you're our legal expert here, and we know that managing copyright is one consideration during this whole book publication process. So I was wondering if you could kind of take a step back and share with us a brief overview of what this is, what copyright is, who gets it, what it covers, and why it's a key aspect of publishing.
Yeah, sure. That's a great place to start. Um, I think copyright is one of these issues that a lot of people kind of recognize is an important part of book publishing, and it's a set of rights. I think a lot of people will appreciate this is a set of rights that you get as an author, but exactly how it springs into being and how it facilitates the publication of your book can be a little mysterious. Um, so you can think about copyright as basically a bundle of rights that you get as the creator of a work to influence how people downstream can interact with your work. And it's really important, I think, to understand the basis of the law in the United States to get some sense of how those rights are meant to function. So in the United States, copyright is based on a part of the US Constitution that gives Congress the power to create laws that promote the progress of science and the useful arts. So that's the main motivation behind it. That's what the Constitution dictates. And then it says to facilitate that, Congress can create these laws that give, for limited times, exclusive rights to authors and inventors. So this is known as the IP clause of the Constitution. So that's really important because it really sets some framework for both what rights authors get and what limitations exist on those rights. So in the United States, the way that copyright works today is that it gives those exclusive rights to authors at the moment of creation. So as soon as you write something down, you get an exclusive right to that work to control a number of uses. You get to control reproduction of that work, public distribution of that work, the creation of derivative works, and then also public performances and displays. And so that's a pretty broad set of rights when you sit down and think about that, right? Like I get to control any reproduction of my work, any even minor little amount of reproduction. That sounds pretty extreme, but the law also bakes in a number of exceptions to those. And again, those exceptions are really oriented towards facilitating, promoting more progress with science and the useful arts. So, for example, you may have heard of the doctrine of fair use. When you're writing, you often are relying on other people's materials, right? Something as simple as putting a block quote in your manuscript is technically a reproduction of someone else's work. And so you need to have some sort of exception to that broad rule of controlling reproduction. And that's what fair use does. So those are kind of the basics of it. In the context of writing a dissertation and the process of converting that to a manuscript, in that context, you as the author are the initial owner. You own the full set of copyrights, and you are often involved in a number of transactions along the way that involve some licensing of those rights. So, number one, typically most universities now will ask you for some sort of license related to that work for purposes of allowing the university to share that work with the world, for example, through a digital repository like eScholarship. So that's one of the first things that happens is you trade away a little bit of your rights at that front end. And what do you get in return? At most institutions, what you get in return is a diploma, right? You satisfy degree requirements. Often one of those degree requirements is that you share your work with the world. The same thing happens when you publish with a publisher is you trade away a certain amount of those rights to the publisher. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes we want to do that, but we want to be very careful about what those rights are that we're giving away, and what rights we retain as authors, so that we can continue to build upon that work and use it in the ways that we might want to.
Yeah, let's expand on that a bit more, like through the lens of say a publishing agreement. So we know that there are a lot of terms and provisions within publishing contracts, and this could be daunting, especially to new book authors who might not have encountered these before. Could you walk us through some of the most important kind of rights related aspects of a typical book publication contracts? I know one thing is called the grant of rights section. So could you unpack that a bit for us?
Sure. So the grant of rights section, typically you'll see that heading in most publishing contracts. That's one of the most important parts of the contract because that's where the author is asked to grant certain rights to the publisher to allow them to publish the work. So obviously, if you own all of the copyright and your publisher wants to print the book and reproduce a number of copies, they have to have some sort of permission to do that. And so the grant of rights section is what grants that authority. So you'll see a few different things that show up in these grants of rights provisions. Sometimes what you'll see is a full-on transfer of copyright from the author to the publisher. And what that's doing is it's taking the whole pie, all of the rights that you have, and it's transferring it over to the publisher and saying, I'm giving this to you in exchange for, and then the rest of the contract is going to detail what you're exchanging it for. And oftentimes there will be little carve outs to say, you're giving all these rights over, but as author, you retain a certain number of rights. But that's one version of this. Excuse me. One of the other things that you will sometimes see is a grant of an exclusive license to the publisher. And again, you're not that could be an exclusive license over all of your rights. It could be an exclusive license over a portion of them or for specific purposes. But that language is important because it means that the publisher and nobody else gets the right to do that thing with your work. That's the exclusive piece. So oftentimes you'll see a transfer of rights that says, or a grant of an exclusive license that grants the publisher an exclusive right to publish the work in certain languages, in certain jurisdictions, and in certain formats. For example, print, ebook, other types of formats like that. Sometimes you might see grants that go broader than that as well. For example, if your work is the kind of work that might result in derivative works, right? The creation of sort of a spin-off or a series or something like that, then you might see a broader set of rights. Audiobook rights is another set of rights that are frequently or increasingly common. Even for scholarly monographs, now I'm seeing that more and more. So those are the kinds of things that you will see in a grant of rights section. The thing that I often tell people to think about when they're signing those things is to look at what sort of rights are you retaining as the author, and how do those relate to the things that you want to do independent of your publisher. So a lot of this is kind of about dividing the pie of who's doing what. Sometimes you're transferring everything over to your publisher, and there are lots of provisions in the contract about all these things that the publisher is going to do for you for your book. They're going to promote it. They're going to do all of the work to format it and edit it and get it in good shape. And those, that's a trade. Sometimes they're going to facilitate translation rights, right? So it wouldn't make sense, for instance, for an author to try to hold back all of the rights related to translation and then expect your publisher to facilitate translation of the work, right? So sometimes you want to give those away because that's just something that you don't want on your plate. So this means that it's neither good nor bad, depending on what your objectives are as an author with those clauses. There are some things that I think are pretty important to watch out for, or like common objectives that I see authors have, where maybe they sign away too much because they haven't thought about those objectives. So I'm happy to get into that, but you may have
Okay.
other questions, things you want me to get into.
I wanted to talk to you a little about open access. So Raina mentioned University of California Press has an open access program for books. Um, could you talk about if an author chooses to publish their book under open access terms, what does this mean from a copyright perspective?
Sure. So I find that actually a lot of the academic authors that I work with are pretty enthusiastic about open access because, again, going back to their objectives with publishing, many of them are not expecting to make a lot of royalties off of the sale of their books. Many of them have no prospect of turning it into some sort of series with spin-off derivatives and movies and things like that. Many of them just want people to engage with their arguments and read and understand, and they want to get the widest possible dissemination of their work so more people can really engage with their arguments. And so for those kind of authors, open access has a lot of appeal. Because when you publish openly, that means at a minimum, and there are kind of differing definitions of open access out there, but at a minimum, it means there's a free copy of your book available on the internet for anyone in the world to download. Now, where you start to get into a little more complication is what else do those readers get when they engage with your work? I've seen some publishers advertise open access as just you've got a free copy on the internet and that's it, and the users get no additional rights to engage with that work. But there are other versions of open access where books are published under Creative Commons licenses, which give rights to the public to engage with that work in certain ways. And those come in a number of flavors. So the kind of standard, most permissive license is called a CC BY license, which is basically a grant of rights to the world to use your work however they want, in a wide variety of ways, with the only limitation being they have to attribute you. They have to attribute you with any of those uses that they make. Now, that's very permissive. And in some ways, that can be really advantageous for people who might want to see kind of maximum application and use of their work out into the world. That can also make some authors very nervous. For instance, I've worked with a number of authors who get quite nervous about the possibility of someone taking their work and maybe mistranslating it and creating a bad derivative work. And so because of those fears, some of those authors will choose to place a Creative Commons no derivatives clause license over their work. And that allows people broadly to engage with your work. They can use it in the classroom. They can make multiple copies for lots of those reasons that, really positive reasons that we might want to see. But it doesn't allow them to create derivatives without getting your permission first. So that's one clause. Another clause that I've seen people use, and this one is where there's sometimes some confusion, is a non-commercial clause. And so the objection there is like, well, I'm happy to give this away for free. I'm happy to let people kind of engage with this in a nonprofit or academic context. But if someone's going to make money off of this, I want to know about that first, and I want to be able to make a little bit too. And those can be very popular. Where I see that becoming a little confusing for some authors is not all uses of your work actually require a CC license or require permission to begin with. And lots of those commercial uses may be may be done even if you didn't license it openly at all. So for instance, we're starting to see this a little bit in the AI space, where the AI companies are scraping works, using them as training data, and not getting permission first. And one of the misconceptions, I think, is that how you license your work using a Creative Commons license makes a difference there. Those technology companies, which are operating in the commercial space, aren't relying on the book's license at all. They're relying purely on the copyright doctrine of fair use to make those arguments. And so licensing it for non-commercial use is not going to do very much to limit that kind of downstream commercial activity.
Great, great. I know you touched on this a little bit before, but maybe we can talk a little bit deeper. What sorts of advice can you give to prospective authors about how to approach and engage in kind of more productive contract negotiations? And I know that Authors Alliance has actually produced like a short guidebook about understanding and negotiating book publication contracts. So, what types of tips can you give to prospective authors on that?
Well, one tip I would give, particularly for academic authors who are looking to publish with university presses, is to ask a lot of questions and don't approach it as an adversarial process. If you've made it through the initial stages, you have an editor who wants your book and wants to publish it. They want to make the contract happen just as much as you do. And so this is not really an adversarial situation. It's more of a place to sort of clarify expectations and goals, and get them all down on paper. And so if I had to give one piece of advice in negotiating in the university press context, it's just ask a lot of questions. And if you're unsure, ask. I have never seen from at least a university press, someone come back from the other side and say, look, I'm sorry, we're done. I can't answer any more questions about this contract. That's it. We're walking away. So, I guess you could be annoying enough that might happen, but I really doubt it. So that's the number one thing. The other thing is I would really encourage authors to make a list of the things that they really want to see happen with their work. And a sort of blue sky of like, what's the best version of this book getting published and the future of this book? And then go back to the contract and see how do those things line up with what's in the book contract. And this is a place where sometimes, what you hear in an email from an editor and what you end up getting in a contract from a legal team don't always match up. And this is where you can ask some clarifying questions to say, well, could we write that down so we're all clear about what the future is going to look like here? So those are, I think, the two big things.
Great. Great. Maybe one final question for you, Dave. Want to get your thoughts on what authors should know about third-party rights. So this means incorporating content created by others, like images or graphs, that you may need to get permission or a license or leverage your rights under fair use in order to include that in your book alongside the text that you're creating. So can you give us a sense of some of those considerations that authors might need to think about in securing rights for images or other kind of third-party content for book publishing?
Yeah, so this is a really big one. And so much of it depends on the kind of material that you're using and how you're engaging with it in your book. Actually, you pointed out one guide that we have. I'll give you a link to another one here. Authors Alliance actually has a guide to third-party permissions and how to clear them. And one of the first things that we tell you in that guide is that actually you may not have to clear everything that you're using. And that's often a misconception. But a lot of that will depend on not just you and not just on the law, but also on your publisher and your publisher's risk tolerance. So you mentioned fair use, for instance. Fair use really encourages uses and allows for uses without permission of works where you're engaging with the work in a significant transformative way. So, for example, where you are commenting or criticizing a work, and you're not supplanting the market for the original. So a sort of classic example where I've seen this come up is I've worked on a number of books with folks in art history, and they can include a number of materials, a large number of third-party materials. And sometimes permissions can be very problematic with these. But often in a field like art history, what you find people doing is they're very substantively engaging with the underlying work, the image. They're commenting on it, they're criticizing it. And for the most part, these are works that, including a 1/4 page thumbnail image of the work is going to do nothing to supplant the market for, prints of that work in the art market. And so there's very strong fair use case there. So there is a pathway towards using works without permission, but there are also a lot of other factors to take into account. One is just scholarly norms in that area. So for instance, I worked with one author, art history person, as it happens, who published a lot of material originating in Japan. And part of the culture was to engage with a certain level of permission, even when you did not need to, just out of respect. And so there are certain aspects like that. Another is really going to be just what is your publisher comfortable with? So most publishing contracts will include a clause that says you as the author are ultimately responsible for clearing all the rights for your book, making sure that you're not saying anything defamatory, just kind of buttoning up all of the legal stuff. So all of this sits on you, but the publisher also has some risk, right? If a book includes like blatant copyright infringement, who do you think is going to get sued? You as the author, and the publisher is going to get left out of it? No, you're all going to get brought into the lawsuit. And so the publisher does have some interest in ensuring that that they are safe as well. And so, that really is going to vary from publisher to publisher. Some of them are much more comfortable with relying on fair use. Some of them will have guidelines internally on what sort of things are acceptable and what are not. So this is a place where you'll probably need to talk with your editor about what they are comfortable with here and what you will have to get permission for.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave, for providing that legal perspective. I think that's really important in thinking through these issues. So that's the end of our panel presentation. Thank you for everyone, for Raina and Jake as well. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll have some time for Q&A from the audience. You can either raise your hand or put your questions in the